Welcome everyone to an optional meeting of the Maine Climate Council, a briefing on an equity assessment that has just been produced by the Mitchell Center. I think I'm grateful for those who are observing and those who are able to be here on the council. We have a pretty packed agenda for the Maine Climate Council over the next couple weeks, so I know many of them were requesting that we record it so they could watch it at night, because I think everyone is trying to get up to speed on a lot of materials as the Maine Climate Council comes into kind of the final stretch of decision making. So my name is Hannah Pingree. I'm the director of the Governor's Office of Policy, Innovation, and the Future, and I co-chair the Maine Climate Council with the DEP Acting Commissioner Melanie Loizam. So again, this is a webinar. We have members of the Maine Climate Council, co-chairs, and staff who are with us as panelists, and we have members of the public also who are viewing. So I'm just going to be really brief, and I'm going to pass it off to Ambassador Dana and then Dr. Shah for just a couple words of introduction. But I just want to say how grateful we are for the work of the Mitchell Center, of the equity advisors, of the staff who really, I would say, have started us on a path of really thinking more deeply about issues of equity as we think about climate. Equity was part of the sort of founding document, the original legislation that created the Maine Climate Council, LD 1769, did talk in detail about the importance of encouraging diversity, inclusion, and equity as a part of our planning process. It specifically suggested that we should ensure that the state's transition to a clean energy economy benefit all residents of the state fairly and equitably, with particular consideration given to sources of employment, income levels, and historical experience. Development of mitigation and adaptation strategies must include consideration of how low-income residents of the state and residents of the state who are members of vulnerable communities will be impacted by climate change and by the transition to a clean energy economy, and how programs and incentives to address such effects can be designed to be accessible to all residents of the state, regardless of income level, age, race, or geographic location. So it has been kind of an important part of our work, but I would say that what you're about to hear about today is a more deep version of how we think about each of the strategies recommended by the working groups and the equity implications of them. The one thing I will just say to kick this off is that while this report is incredibly detailed and helpful, as you will read in their recommendations, it is really the beginning of our work in this process. A lot of their recommendations are about equity needing to be a long-term commitment with the right people at the table, ongoing discussion with communities, as well as careful consideration every time you implement a new program or every time there's a budget decision or a change. So I think that's sort of a good way, I think, for the Climate Council to start thinking about this work as not a report that we put on a shelf, but a long-term commitment to how we think more deeply about how the impacts of climate, as well as the opportunities as we transition to a clean energy economy, can be felt equitably for all Maine people, especially those Maine people who are going to feel the impacts of rising sea levels and changes in industries, or those communities who have been left behind over and over again. So we have two Climate Council members who are really deeply engaged in these issues and offer kind of, I think, important perspectives, and that is Ambassador Maulian Dana, who is the tribal ambassador for the Penobscot Nation, as well as Dr. Shah, who is the head of the Maine CDC. I think they're both leaders in the state in their own right on many issues, but really thoughtful on this issue in particular. So I'm going to pass it off to Ambassador Dana and then to Dr. Shah, and then we will introduce the Mitchell Center folks who will really go through the details for all of you. After that, we're going to hear a couple reflections from our equity advisory group, sort of some of their particular thoughts about the work. So with that, I will pass it off to Ambassador Dana and thank her for being here.
Thank you so much, Director Pingree, and it's great to see everyone. And I have to say, my kids feel like my job is kind of boring. They're 11 and 13, they're about that age. But today I said I got to be on a Zoom with Dr. Shah, and they were very impressed with that. So thank you, Doctor, for boosting my cred with my kids. I really appreciate this work. It's definitely something that I'm constantly connected to, and I reviewed the report, and there's a lot about it that I truly appreciate. I really liked the ability to be able to give my feedback directly prior to this meeting. And something great that's come out of the past few months is that we are able to have a town hall tonight with all tribal citizens of Maine that are interested. So I'll be giving a brief overview of our work thus far, and we'll be collecting the thoughts and concerns and opinions of any tribal members that are interested, which you know, is a super important step. And I think just to give a bird's eye view of kind of my role and why I feel it's very important to be here sitting on the council. The Penobscot Nation had a representative to the legislature for at least 100 years. We decided to pull that representative in 2015. At the time, I wasn't in elected office yet. I was working a human resources job and just a concerned tribal member. And I voted for that move in our general meeting lawmaking process. And I came to the State House when the representatives walked out. And little did I know that we would create this ambassador position. I would be elected to office and later appointed, and I would get to kind of embark on this new journey of what our involvement with the state looks like. And I can say, you know, I was appointed in 2017, and I really enjoyed a lot of the work thus far. This is a long legacy of distrust, of tension, of broken promises, of a lot of kind of, you know, real barriers and understanding between the tribes and the state on a lot of issues. And I see so much of that being solved with really clear, direct communication, consultation, absolutely. You know, kind of the last straw when we pulled the representatives was then Governor LePage had lifted the tribal consultation order, and it was just insulting on many levels. So to be asked to sit on the Climate Council, to get to work with the governor in her office on so many bills, to have the opportunity to participate in so much of the legislative process in my position now, I feel like it's a really great beginning again. I think the ambassador role, I know I'm a little bit biased, but I feel like it's a good step towards acting like a sovereign nation and engaging in government to government work. So I kind of bring all of that to the Climate Council. I also bring my upbringing as an Indigenous Wabanaki woman of color in the state of Maine. I was raised with two Penobscot parents, understanding that we don't own the land, we are stewards of it. We have a relationship with the lands and the waters and the animals. Everything's connected, there's no hierarchy. So a lot of the kind of present day mainstream society ways of looking at land and resources and even money and the economy is very different from the values of tribal people. And I think we're dealing with those differences. We're also dealing with the long-standing legacies of oppression, of trauma, of attempted genocide, of colonization, and the inequities that are the result of all of those things. So I think we can get to a much better place in all of our communities, but I think that that only comes about with honesty, with respect between our communities and our neighbors and the state of Maine, and true equity. I appreciate that this report uses the term equity instead of equality, because I really think that that gets to the goal of what we're trying to do here. I obviously speak for my nation, and you know, I bring the view of a tribal person, but I've also been engaged in some really great work with a permanent commission on the status of racial, indigenous, and racial populations in Maine. And I probably didn't say that exactly right. It's a very long title. But we've been able to look at a lot of policy over the summer, a lot of the current health disparities in the pandemic. You know, the pandemic is kind of especially triggering for tribal communities because our ancestors were nearly decimated by diseases intentionally given to them. So I think that we've kind of sealed off our communities and taken it very, very seriously. And we do have very low rates, knock on wood, because of that. But it's definitely bringing about a lot of trauma for us and a lot to think about. So I really appreciate, you know, there's a sentence in the beginning of the report that we're going to look at today. Climate action is not inherently just. And I really wanted to highlight that because it's so true. We can see this as an issue of jobs or the economy, or how are we going to, you know, build better buildings and have renewable energy. And we can see it as kind of on one level. But I think for it to work, it needs to operate on many levels. It needs to uplift vulnerable populations, and it needs to take into account working towards equity, because the health and wellness of the whole is really only as good as those marginalized and oppressed populations. So I truly appreciate the opportunity to review it and to share with you a little bit of my story today. I'm hopeful that our tribal town hall goes well later, and I know that we'll have a lot of feedback after that for you all. So it's great to see you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Dana. Turn it over to now Dr. Shah, who doesn't need any introduction, as Ambassador Dana said. We've seen the chocolate bars and the fame and the Maine magazine, so welcome.
Well, thank you, Director Pingree, and Ambassador Dana. Thank you as well. It's a pleasure and an honor to join the virtual stage with you, share the virtual stage with you today. And I'm delighted to join everyone today as well for this really, really important discussion around the nexus of health equity and climate change matters. I want to just provide a few minutes of comments before we get to the real work of the afternoon to situate some of the conversation and discussion. We're talking about these issues in a summer that has been not only by devastation wrought by COVID-19, but also wildfires along the entire western coast, to say nothing of tropical storms morphing into hurricanes all along the southern and eastern coast of our country, to say nothing again of the ways in which similar actions regarding climate change have wrought havoc across the globe. We alone in Maine haven't been spared. There have been reports and analyses around the extent to which our extremely dry summer and resulting drought are directly tied to some of the impacts of climate change. I'd like to take a moment just to situate this a little bit more in the COVID framework. Before I get to that, I just wanted to remark that COVID, of course, has brought so many challenges, and what I'm about to share is minuscule in comparison to the morbidity and mortality of so many. But I just wanted to share that a personal regret of mine related to COVID is that it has taken time such that I haven't been able to participate so much in climate-related activities. I wanted to take a second to give a shout out to the members of the Public Health and Resilience Committee who have carried on. I'm sorry that I haven't been as vocal of a participant as I was before late January, but hopefully in the near future I'll be able to re-engage on those fronts. But as it relates to today, you know, yesterday we crossed a morbid threshold in the globe, which was 1 million individuals who had passed away with COVID-19. And late last week, we passed another nationwide threshold, just 200,000 deaths, just in our country alone, related to COVID-19. And as we've passed those sad thresholds, I think we have to ask ourselves about whether we have taken too narrow of an approach in conceiving our response to the outbreak. We've viewed much of the cause of the current crisis as purely a matter of infectious disease. And indeed, all of our interventions thus far have been focused on cutting and severing lines of viral transmission and using that as our principal mechanism to gain control over the spread of the disease, at least in Maine. And you know, a lot of the models that we use in our analysis are fundamentally ones that posit that the virus is in direct competition with us, and those are the only two factors that are swirling in the analysis. But I think in connection with today's discussion, there is room to question whether that focus is too narrow, and whether what we've learned so far about COVID-19 tells a story that is perhaps too simple. There are other categories of analysis that are interacting in and around our population that very much affect how we should respond, as well as think about the root causes of COVID-19. One of those, of course, is the interaction between infectious diseases and climate change. Another one that I'm not going to talk about, but will mention briefly, is the interaction between infectious diseases and non-infectious diseases. But let's focus a little bit on climate change. We can think about this issue in a couple of different ways. One of which is the emergence of the virus itself, emerging as it did in the highly dense, highly crowded city of the central Chinese city of Wuhan, a city of 8 million people surrounded by an additional 3 million people just around the city border proper. So a metropolis of 11 million people, generated of that size by pressures around urbanization. Those pressures then directly being linked to things like urban crowding, all of which have direct ties to climate change. It should be no surprise that when a small point mutation emerges in a setting that is so dense, so tightly crowded, we see the emergence of what was initially an outbreak, then an epidemic, and now a global pandemic. But more generally, we should, and through the lens of equity, ask ourselves hard questions about the linkages between COVID-19 and health equity. I think if you think about those things for just more than a minute, you start to see that those linkages, those connections are inextricable and almost impossible to separate. Climate change has its worst effects on people who already have low health equity to begin with. Those who, for a number of reasons, don't have adequate opportunities to be healthier. Indeed, it's these health inequities themselves that contribute to placing individuals and communities at risk for the deleterious effects of climate change, whether that's from flooding or, as I'm talking about today, related to related to COVID-19. When it comes to health equity and COVID-19, where you start the process bears a strong impact on where you might ultimately end up with COVID-19. And though we all are at risk with respect to the health effects of climate change, some groups are more vulnerable and thus less resilient to the health threats here. In fact, climate change intensifies the risks for each and every one of these populations. I just wanted to provide a couple of examples of the ways in which climate change can have a direct impact on health. So at base, poverty, we all know, can keep individuals from accessing healthcare, meaning that they don't get the necessary preventive care that might protect them from health issues, such as, say, asthma, until they are already sick. Poverty also keeps homeowners from accessing, whether it's homeowners insurance or it prevents renters from accessing renters insurance, which means that they may not be able to make home improvements to protect their health from threats that we know are going to be emerging resulting from climate change, things like greater rates of mold, to say nothing of stealing their houses against things like threats from rising tide, or a particularly twin set of risks here in Maine, high precipitation or the risk of wildfires. Individuals who start with the lower health equity can't prepare their houses or apartments, take advantage and take out homeowners insurance or flood insurance to protect their own abodes from those risks. Those who are poor may not have the means to move to somewhere with fewer health risks that may make them less vulnerable to climate change, such as a home with air conditioning, or a home that's further from a polluting industry, or a home that places them less at risk for rising precipitation or wildfires. And then, of course, when disaster strikes. Poverty in and of itself puts individuals who have been displaced at having fewer resources and resiliency to allow them to rebound in a way that those with greater means and access would. These are just a few examples of the ways in which health equity and the nexus of that with climate change mean that individuals who are at lower socioeconomic means to start with will continue to bear the disproportionate share of the burden. COVID-19 has not so much created these as much as it has amplified them. We see that time and time again with respect to COVID-19. Individuals who may not have the means to live in smaller houses, but rather larger communal houses, themselves are at higher risk for COVID-19 because of how quickly it can spread in households. Individuals who may not have as robust insurance have less ability to access testing. And individuals who already face job insecurity may not have the economic power to say to their employer, it looks like I'm going to need to be off for 2 weeks in order to quarantine. All of those things have very definite health impacts, not just for the individuals, but for the communities in a state. That's why I'm so delighted that the committee today will be discussing these issues in greater detail. Director Pingree, Ambassador Dana, thank you so much for the invitation to join you and provide what I hope will be some food for further discussion and thought.
Thank you, Dr. Shah. And yeah, we will continue to claim you as a Maine Climate Council member. So we totally appreciate your time and your comments today, as well as Ambassador Dana. Both really thoughtful and really, I think, good as we go into the final stretch of thinking about our strategies and how to embed these issues more deeply. I'm going to pass it off to Linda Silka, David Hart, and I think they're going to introduce Sarah Kellerman. And again, we are very, very grateful to the Mitchell Center at the University of Maine, who really became our partners in this work, and they're going to present the results of their work over the summer.
Thank you. David, should I go ahead?
You bet.
Great. First, we would like to say from the Mitchell Center, just how pleased we were at this opportunity to take a lot of what we have been hearing about and thinking about and really working hard to gather very clear information from a lot of other states and a lot of other places in terms of what's going on, and to be able to provide, with the help of so many people, a fairly detailed, you say fairly, it's 113 pages, please, a detailed description of what we need to be thinking about and the opportunities that exist. When I tell people as I talk to people in other parts of the country, they say, I always thought Maine was kind of a special place, but boy, all these people are doing this and donating their time to really make sure you're thinking about things like equity. So we're really looking forward to this opportunity to kind of lead you through some of what we found. And there's a reason that Sarah's going to lead us through. We were extremely lucky in being able to have her be a part of our team. Sarah, didn't know you before this process. You're just the most marvelous worker, and I think all of you will see this as she leads us briefly through the report. So,
David, anything you want to add?
Take it away, Sarah.
All right. Can everybody see my? All right.
Good, Sarah.
So here we go. Today we're going to talk about assessing the potential equity outcomes of Maine's Climate Action Plan. So first of all, I wanted to say thank you, Ambassador Dana and Dr. Shah, for your thoughtful remarks. You both really hit the nail on the head multiple times, and it was really great to hear from you both. Today, I'm going to run you through a description of what we did, how we did it, and generally what we found. So here we go. We started our work by learning about different approaches that have been used in assessing equity as it relates to climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies. We looked at documents from different cities, states, and countries. The process informed our thinking and provided us with an excellent base of knowledge from which we could do our work. Our work brings together the thinking of activists and scholars from many fields. Broadly, we've based our work on the concepts and practices of environmental justice, climate justice, and energy justice. Each of these ways of thinking about the distribution of benefits and burdens and the effects of systemic racism, oppression, and marginalization on people's lives has utility when considering the equity of a climate action plan. Here, I think it's important to take a minute to talk about why we use the term equity rather than equality, which is something that Ambassador Dana already touched on. We use equity rather than equality here, acknowledging that equal distribution of resources is not enough. Instead, equity takes into account the fact that systems of oppression keep certain people from accessing resources, and an equitable system seeks to provide increased resources to marginalized and disadvantaged communities. The framework we constructed is based on the work of climate change, mitigation, and transportation scholars Karen Lucas and Kate Pangborn, and we have updated it and altered it substantially to meet the needs of Maine. I'll talk more about the details of the framework shortly. Before beginning our analysis, we received feedback on the framework from the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future and the Climate and Equity Advisory Committee. Once the framework was finalized, it was used to analyze each strategy from the working groups, which were buildings, housing, and infrastructure, coastal and marine, community resilience planning, emergency management, energy, natural and working lands, public health, and transportation. Finally, based on the work we did, we offer some broad recommendations regarding the path forwards. What you see on this slide is a diagram of the framework we constructed to analyze each strategy. Each analysis is broken down into 3 parts: social impacts, effects on vulnerable populations, and participation and inclusion. While there are often overlaps between the information in each category, this system constructs a useful map which helps to ensure that the person conducting the analysis is thorough and sees each strategy from many angles. The first angle is social impacts. The term social impacts refers to the intended and unintentional outcomes of climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies. Thus, this section explores both the risk of inequity due to unforeseen burdens, as well as positive side effects of target policies, otherwise known as co-benefits. We break this section down into 3 subgroups, assessing how a particular strategy would impact the wealth and health of Maine people, as well as whether the strategy would impact access to services. While the first part of the assessment is rather broad, asking about the effects of a strategy on all Maine people, the second part turns attention to potential equity impacts on historically marginalized communities who will disproportionately face climate risks while having fewer resources to respond to those risks. You'll notice that we use the term vulnerable, and I want to take a minute to explain why we use this term. The term vulnerable is not meant to imply a general sense of victimhood. Instead, we use it to describe the ways in which historical and systemic discrimination, exploitation, and underrepresentation have left some residents of Maine more vulnerable to the effects of climate change than others. Vulnerable populations are frontline communities when it comes to climate change. This means that due to systemic oppression and injustice, they will experience the first and worst effects of a changing climate. So, when we say vulnerable, we mean vulnerable in the face of climate change due to historic and systemic factors, rather than vulnerable in general. We use the categories of financial vulnerability, social and demographic vulnerability, and geographic vulnerability to discuss the effects of strategies on groups of people who will experience the first and worst effects of climate change in the absence of effective intervention. Finally, the framework touches on participation and inclusion. Whenever historically marginalized or vulnerable communities stand to be affected by the outcomes of a strategy, their meaningful participation and input in the process of making decisions and planning outcomes is key from the outset. First, we ask the question who, which elicits the creation of a list of those communities who should be involved. Second, we ask the question, is participation adequate and meaningful? This gets at the idea that involvement should be more than symbolic and more than a polite gesture at inclusion. and should actually reflect the values and preferences of the community in question, and should provide an opportunity to create change. So moving on, here we have an example of how the framework is used to analyze a strategy. This is one strategy from the Buildings, Infrastructure, and Housing Working Group. We're going to look at Strategy 2, Transition to Cleaner Heating and Cooling Systems. So first is social impacts, and the first social impact we look at is wealth. This policy is likely to have positive effects for those who participate and do transition to clean heating and cooling systems. Financial incentive programs must be explicitly targeted at those who need financial assistance most in order to upgrade their space and water heating and cooling systems. Lack of time and high upfront costs may keep people from participating in spite of increased incentives. The second social impact is health. Upgrading to a more efficient heating and cooling system will have positive health impacts if it is paired with weatherization of old and drafty housing stock to ensure increased health co-benefits. Consistent benefits associated with energy efficiency programs are reported in mental health, well-being, comfort, self-perceived health, respiratory systems, and even reduced use of health services. The final social impact we look at is accessibility. Here we found that expanded financial incentive programs can increase accessibility if they are targeted at those who could not otherwise afford to upgrade. Next up is effects on vulnerable populations. In Maine, low-income populations, and especially rural low-income populations, often pay a higher percentage of their income in order to meet their at-home energy needs. An effective incentive program could increase access to cleaner, more efficient heating and cooling systems for financially vulnerable Maine people. Additionally, people of color, older people, and renters often pay a higher percentage of their income in order to meet their at-home energy needs. And Dr. Shah touched on the way that these issues are interconnected. Again, a targeted incentive program could assist in alleviating the financial burden associated with making the switch to cleaner heating and cooling systems. Here, it is also important to mention that information about financial incentive programs and potential regulation changes must be distributed to all populations experiencing high energy burdens in a way that is culturally appropriate and understandable. Special efforts must be made to reach those who have historically been excluded from efficiency programs due to language barriers, and those who lack access to the internet and the advertising and information available there. Finally, Maine has large numbers of residents with high energy burdens, especially in the rural and island areas. The financial incentive aspect of this strategy should explicitly target those living in rural areas, and especially rural low-income households. The third part of the analysis is participation and inclusion. Here we ask, which vulnerable Maine people stand to be affected by this strategy? The answer here is that the strategy has the potential to impact a broad range of Maine people. It is most critical that Maine recognize those with the highest energy burdens and work with them to ensure access to efficient space and water heating and cooling systems. Additionally, renters should not be excluded from the benefits of this strategy. The second question we ask is it enough? Is participation by members of stakeholder groups adequate and meaningful? Stakeholder engagement and involvement for this strategy should be mostly in the form of education and outreach. This outreach should be targeted at those with high energy burdens. This outreach information should be culturally appropriate, available in an offline form, and available in many languages. Goals for the outreach and engagement process should be established, and monitoring should take place during implementation to ensure these goals are met. Now that we've looked at an example of how the framework was used to assess each strategy, we can shift focus and talk about some key findings and common themes that came up throughout our process. Many of the strategies across working groups, specifically buildings, infrastructure and housing, transportation, and energy, suggested the use of incentive programs. The working groups were consistent in their recognition that these incentive programs must be developed in such a way that they equitably distribute resources, and we reaffirm this line of thinking. It is critical that incentive programs target and assist those in the greatest need first, lest the incentives be doled out to those who could already afford an upgrade without assistance. Second, we would like to emphasize that uplifting the most vulnerable people in Maine will benefit all people in Maine. It is clear from reading the strategies that members of the working groups were already aware of this point when they went to work, but it bears repeating and is a point worth making explicit. Third, while involving vulnerable populations in the process of shaping outcomes is critical, there are often structural barriers to participation and inclusion which need to be addressed in order to encourage meaningful participation. Next, the challenges created by Maine's geography and rural nature is another theme we found to be consistent throughout our work. Maine's emissions largely come from transportation and home heating, which is uncommon. We found that the working groups were innovative and thoughtful in their considerations of these issues that are unique to Maine. Finally, in reading through the strategies and analyzing the potential equity outcomes, we recognize that this is an opportunity for Maine to be a leader. Insofar as the Climate Action Plan creates change through the lens of equity, Maine can show that prioritizing equity can assist in the achievement of climate goals. It is important to acknowledge that climate action is not inherently just, as Ambassador Dana said earlier, and therefore the process of shaping climate policies will require thoughtful planning and action to ensure that Maine's future is both resilient and equitable. Our report includes 8 broad recommendations based on our analysis of all the working group strategies. These recommendations can be summarized as falling into 3 different categories. The first category could be called long-term commitment to equity. In these recommendations, we suggest that the Maine Climate Council create an equity working group to serve alongside the other working groups. We also recommend a process for goal setting and measuring outcomes related to equity during the implementation process. The second category of recommendations relates to participation and inclusion. We state that it can never be too early to ask the questions, who should be involved? How can they shape the process? And what are their barriers to involvement? Asking these questions early will set the stage for timely and meaningful engagement from vulnerable stakeholder groups. Additionally, we recommend that the Climate Council consider compensating members of vulnerable stakeholder groups who do participate. Finally, we recommend considering the multitude of factors that influence equity and inequity and the ways in which they are all interconnected. And that is something that Dr. Shah did a really excellent job of illustrating earlier. This is, of course, just an overview, and there's a lot more where this came from. If you're interested, the entire report is available online. I saw that Cassie put the link in the chat earlier. And I think it was also in the email that went out about this webinar. And finally, as Director Pingree mentioned at the beginning, I want to stress again that this is just a beginning of the process and that Linda and David and I are so happy to be a part of it. So thank you for listening.
Sarah, that was wonderful. If we could clap, we would be clapping. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I've lost, this is very much like Maine. I have lost my screen, so I can't see you, but I can hear you. And so my apologies if it's just a little bit challenging for us now. David, do you want to say a few things before the move into the discussion?
Sure. Let me first thank Sarah for doing such a fantastic job, not just from the presentation, but from the day we met her. In addition to all the important work that the Climate Council and the working groups have done, I think this equity effort is another example of the important role young people are playing to create a brighter future in Maine. And Sarah's a great example of that, but you have a lot of leaders, young leaders that are involved in this work and that aspire to be involved in the future. And so I take a lot of optimism from that. The real goal here is to have a conversation to hear from anyone that has questions, has advice. We got a lot of excellent advice from the Climate and Equity Advisory Committee, as well as the outstanding staff in the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future. So we're already very fortunate to have benefited from a lot of that, but I feel virtually certain that there are more good ideas. And I think, again, that Director Pingree made the case that and we agree that this is a long-term effort. We have a long way to go. So the sooner we put those good ideas on the table and figure out how to put them to work, the better. Linda, I don't know if the handling of sort of facilitation of any kind of a discussion will turn out to be easier if you can see things, and if you still lost your video, I could try to do the facilitation. Do you have any preference?
I think it'd be great if you did that, and I'll just jump in. I can hear well, but I can hear everybody's great voices, but that would be helpful.
So I don't know, I would turn to any of my colleagues in the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future. What's the best way to get a discussion going here so we can benefit from all of the expertise and wisdom of this wonderful group?
Great. Yeah, David, I think that's I think Brian will help lead a discussion. We would encourage Climate Council members you can use the raise hand function, you can put something in the chat, or you can just turn on your video and wave wildly, and Brian will call on you. Brian, I don't know if should we jump straight to kind of dialogue and questions, or I know there might be a member or two of our advisory group who are here just to offer some additional thoughts. Yeah. I will say that Representative Lydia Bloom, member of the Maine Climate Council, has posted a question of can we or have we adequately identified the most vulnerable populations explicitly? If we are prioritizing them, how do we identify them? So I think that is a question maybe to start with any of you, and then Brian can sort of help facilitate from there. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Does anybody want to try to answer that question from Representative Bloom?
I was going to turn to Linda first. Linda, did you understand the question?
Yes, I think so. And that's a great question. Part of what we did to understand what should be looked at is, first of all, we looked at what other states have done, cities have done, and countries have done. So we used that to come up with a fairly detailed list of sort of what has the research indicated that's really important. Then what we did next was to say, what's missing from that? So what is distinctive about Maine that we need to be able to be sure to include in terms of the rural nature of the communities, the low income, various kinds and ways that people can, where equity hasn't yet been achieved. So we really tried to first look at what other people have done, but then say, now let's customize it for Maine. And I think you'll see as you go through the report that that's what we've tried to do, so that there's information there about lots of different possible ways what's being planned could reduce the inequities or could increase them. And since this is just the start of things, and all of you have so much experience and so many ideas, you may see other things that need to be done. But that's where we started, with the literature, with information about the state, with how to bring those together.
Great, thanks, Linda. So I'll do a light facilitation here of the discussion and the Q&A, excuse me, but first I'd like to start off by acknowledging the advisory committee that we had working with this group. And I'm just gonna put the list of folks up here on the screen. This group really came together to help with two things. The first was, and it kind of gets to Representative Bloom's question, help us identify particular groups and constituencies and vulnerable populations across the state to do outreach to in conjunction with the process, the public process that we did this summer. and that's ongoing throughout the fall. They help provide important connections to those groups, and we're following up on those as we speak. And so that was really task number 1 for this advisory committee. Task number 2, as Sarah and David and Linda mentioned, was providing review and grounding of the equity framework as it was developed, and then the report as it came out. So they were the first set of eyes on the report and the framework, and provided really important feedback to the Mitchell Center and the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the future. So I want to thank everybody here on the advisory committee. And we do have Suzanne McDonald, who is both a work group member and an advisory committee member, who is on the call with us this afternoon. And I'd like to start off with asking Suzanne if she would just share a couple of words about how she hopes this work from the equity assessment makes its way into the climate action plan, which is due on December 1st. But then importantly, how it carries on into implementation of that plan in the coming years. So Suzanne, if I can turn it over to you for a couple of thoughts. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Brian. Thanks so much for the invite to share, and to you, your office, and Director Pingree, of course, for the invitation to be a part of this critically important work. As Brian said, I'm Suzanne McDonald. I'm the Chief Community Development Officer at the Island Institute. I live in Rockland, and I would say for almost 2 decades, my work has really focused at the intersection between communities and natural resource extraction and energy development. And so more recently, I had the opportunity to participate as a member of the Buildings, Infrastructure, and Housing Working Group. I reminded my colleagues there I was not the expert in building design or building code or cross-laminate timber, but rather was trying to ask the questions about who are the people that occupy these buildings, and where are the communities in which those buildings sit, what are their unique needs, and how do we keep them at the forefront. It was a great honor to be a part of this discussion over the last couple of months and hear various perspectives on this issue. I tried to bring my experience of kind of being in the trenches, working alongside homeowners, schools, businesses for the last several years, trying to help them to access energy efficiency and other clean energy resources to get weatherization work done. That experience, when you try to weatherize homes 20 miles in the middle of the ocean out on Matinicus or out on North Haven, you learn a lot about how policy and program design can somehow inadvertently leave some Mainers behind. And so for the last several years, we've been asking the question at the Island Institute of what does this mean for the rest of the state? As the most rural state in the nation, what does it mean for our climate policy and strategy to make sure that we're allowing all Mainers to be able to benefit from this work equitably? So I guess my primary hope is that, and I think, you know, Director Pingree made a good point, that this is the very beginning and not the end of a set of commitments that are going to become hardwired into the state's climate approach. I think, you know, we talked today, the fabulous work from the Mitchell Center, the initial piece is the design stage. Are we asking the questions of equity right up front? As we move from the initial analysis to the recommendations and the design of various initiatives, how do we lead with the state's most vulnerable communities or most vulnerable Mainers? How do we make sure that they are set to benefit from this first, as opposed to as an afterthought or years down the road? We know there are unique things about Maine, like we are the most rural state in the nation. How do we make sure that our policies reflect that, and we don't necessarily just go with a traditional markets-based approach that maybe is quite certain to leave many of these people behind? I'm really interested in how this work evolves to make sure that we're holding ourselves accountable by assessing the effectiveness of this. Are we actually hitting the mark? Are we getting it right and sticking with it? So how do we co-define a set of metrics that allow us to evaluate our success here and, you know, pivot when we need to? And then I think a really important piece of this that we talked about is around that stakeholder engagement. How is this the beginning of a chance to start to listen deeply and to learn from those more affected Mainers or vulnerable Mainers? How do we build meaningful relationships that allow us to really learn what climate means for them and what these barriers may mean for them? And yeah, create that sort of bi-directional learning opportunity, build trust. And, you know, we can't, it's been absolutely phenomenal, the number of people who have participated in the feedback sessions and the survey work. But I think if we really want to deeply learn how to overcome these systemic barriers, we need to forge a longer set of relationships and really start to understand these issues more deeply. So yeah, it's been a fantastic start, and I can see how we're differentiating ourselves as a state already. I think this is really groundbreaking work, and thank you all for making this be a part of it at this stage, and look forward to supporting it moving down the road.
Thanks very much, Suzanne. We had two other members of the advisory committee who couldn't join us this afternoon, but they did share some remarks to the same question that I just posed to Suzanne. And so I thought I would just read those briefly to you. Gabriella Alcalde from the Sewell Foundation wrote in and said, "My overarching hope is that equity is brought to every consideration by state and local governments, ideally through a standard process such as a combination of environmental and racial equity impact assessment tool, and that any incentives recommended by the Maine Climate Council would do this to assure that they do not exclude or unintentionally harm any group of people. Second, I hope that the structures and processes within governments can adapt themselves so that creative, different than what's been done so far approaches can be implemented across governmental divisions and their budgets." And then Deborah Ivanwa from the Maine Equal Justice wrote in and said, "My hope is that we continue to prioritize renters, and especially low-income renters, thinking about how to ensure landlords implement climate-friendly practices. Additionally, how to make sure immigrant communities that work in rural Maine and work in agriculture get the information and can protect themselves from the danger of climate change, especially because it is a public health crisis for those communities. It would also be good to think about low-income people generally and how they can make environmentally friendly changes in cost-effective ways." So two other voices who weren't able to join us today, but really great to have that information added into the discussion here. So for the Climate Council members who are panelists on the call today, I'm going to ask you to use either the raise hand function or wave at the screen, and we'll call on you with any questions that you have for the Mitchell Center crew, or with observations or discussion points that you'd like to offer up for the afternoon.
I just want to throw out maybe a point to highlight to the Mitchell Center folks or the advisory group, or also to Ambassador Dana. I think that you have some recommendations I'm reading on the screen over here in the report that are sort of big picture about how we do our work, and some specific, I would say some specific sections on process that the Climate Council would implement going forward. I'm wondering if if any of you would speak to that, just to kind of highlight that. I think Sarah did a good job of framing it, but just hit a couple of details if possible.
Director Pingree, I have a kind of clarifying question. Are you saying you'd like to know more about what we said in the recommendations? There are 8 of them, or is that where you're hoping we'll go?
Yeah,
right
I'm actually just thinking, we hope everyone reads the report, but for those listening
sure.
right now,
right.
Explaining that and some of those, you don't have to go through all 8, but some of those 8 I think really speak to both some specific recommendations for Climate Council process, for engagement and how we do our work. So I'm wondering if you'll just sort of highlight those again, because I think there are things that I'm thinking about, and it would be good to get the rest of the council thinking about more deeply.
That's wonderful. Sarah, do you want to do that? I think you know them as well as Linda and me.
And you do a great job.
Yeah, that too.
So sort of on the higher level end of things, we definitely think that creating some sort of system for ensuring that this is an ongoing process is step 1. And I think that is something that we've been hearing from our colleagues at the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future all summer. This is something that, everyone is aware of at this point, that this is the beginning. We're starting something. And the way that might look, one thing that is really wonderful and hopeful about the way that this climate action plan works is that it is a process that repeats itself every 4 years, which gives the opportunity to make changes and correct oversights. And that is something that Portland, Oregon dealt with when they were creating their climate action plan. And of course, it's different city versus state, but their first climate action plan came into being, and then they realized that they had a little bit missed the boat on equity. And so what they did was they went back and created an equity working group and created actually an entire separate document that addressed equity within their climate action plan. And that got to be included in their second version of the climate action plan. And so that's something that Maine has not missed the boat there. Here we are having this meeting right now, but the way that they used the iterative approach towards creating the climate action plan to insert extra details regarding equity into the second version is something that I think is worth being aware of as this moves into the stages of implementation and even thinking about the next time that this comes up 4 years from now. We also think with something that's really important and that we don't go into in detail in the report, but is something that should be prioritized, is creating a system for monitoring equity during implementation of all of the strategies that become policy. And this is something that has been done in various other city climate action plans. One specifically I can think of off the top of my head is Boston has a really good system for checking their outcomes. So they have measurable goals, and they go back to those measurable goals and check to see how their equity benchmarks are measuring up against their goals. And then so participation and inclusion is another theme of our recommendations. And one specific goal would be to compensate people who do bring their time and expertise in talking with the state. It's sometimes really hard for people to make the time or to be available, and sharing experience is work, and people should be compensated for their work. So that is one thing that we would recommend. I may have missed some other things as well. So if Linda or David or someone else who has read the report wants to jump in and talk about the recommendations, they're welcome to do so.
Sarah, that was great. I would just add that as we were thinking about the recommendations, we were recognizing the ways that people being able to participate are very much linked to some of the kinds of other issues that come up in Maine. All of the discussion about the absence of, I mean, we're having this meeting today, for example, on the internet. The internet access is not a separate issue. It becomes an important issue when we're asking people to be a part of a process. We combine really difficult winters with poor online access and with a loss of a number of other potentialities, and those need to be recognized as important as we all think together about how people can share their views.
And if I could just take one more that I think is our last recommendation, just to reiterate something that Dr. Shah said earlier. We see climate as just one of a whole host of things that can either be long-term changes or shocks to the system that disproportionately affect vulnerable populations. So whether it's the closure of paper mills or it's a public health crisis, all of these things, or global trade issues sometimes do this. We see tariffs that have adversely affected populations. All of these issues this is where the systems thinking that Dr. Shah described is really going to be important for Maine and other regions. Like, we can't look at this in one piece at a time, we have to look at the whole and how it all fits together. So it's very important to do exactly what he recommended.
Thank you. Representative Bloom has put another question in the chat here, and it starts to get at something that I was going to ask, and that is, what additional opportunities for work do you see in this area? And her question specifically is, does the report suggest any equity benchmarks for Maine?
Anybody, any preference for who handles this one?
I'll start by saying that in terms of benchmarks, this is an ongoing process. And although we say a few things related to that, this is really work that needs to be done, and that's important that it be done. We did, in the few months we had to do this, we pointed to some of the things that need to be covered, but definitely I think it would be very helpful as we go forward as a state and have some more information to have benchmarks.
I think this is also one of the features of the way that we received all of the strategies from the working groups. And so, yes, one of our recommendations is the creation of equity benchmarks for Maine, which goes in with holding the state accountable for the change it wishes to create. But those benchmarks are going to have to be delineated based on the category that they fall under. So perhaps some will be more specific to buildings, infrastructure, and housing. Some will be more specific to transportation. So that is something that perhaps could come out of more work within honing these strategies as they progress towards the governor's office this winter.
Thanks, Sarah. Again, for council members, please raise your hand or enter your questions into the chat and we'll call on you. I do want to acknowledge we have Leslie Furnow, also one of our advisory committee members who's been elevated to a panelist now so she can speak. Leslie, is there anything you want to offer for how you hope this work carries forward?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I was a little frustrated. I couldn't even say hello. So thank you for bringing me in. Yeah, what everybody has said has been absolutely right on the mark. Suzanne and Linda really said a lot of what I intended to say, but I think that one of the things I think we need to think about as we approach this is whether this is going to be taken up by the governor as a climate proposal, or whether it's going to be taken up as an equity proposal. And I realize that it's not really two different things, but I think that Linda alluded to the fact that equity crosses all kinds of boundaries, and so did Dr. Shah, and it really isn't just about climate. And so I think if we're going to make equity a really key focus of attention in Maine for all kinds of problems, this is one example of how we can implement it or how we can apply our equity lens. But I would like to see us sure that we are going to be carrying this forward in all of our social decision-making and government decision-making, not just through the Mills administration, but provide ways that we can make this be part of our culture. And so I'm thinking, I know that's very long-term and very big, but I think we need to make as a state a long-term commitment to equity, strengthening participation and inclusion. And part of that involves figuring out how to reach people. I'm representing the rural areas of Piscataquis County. And one of the biggest problems is reaching people who are the vulnerable populations that were outlined in the beginning of the presentation, the rural elderly, rural people, in fact, not just elderly. In fact, if you reach the elderly, you're also reaching the children. I mean, the rural population is difficult to reach. And so I think we really need to talk more about how to do that. I think paying people for their participation is essential, among other things. So that's what I will say for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Leslie. Senator Carson.
Thank you. As I listen to this discussion, which I think is an enormously important one and is on the mark, I think about particularly the economic, but also the political context within which the recommendations will A, be fashioned, and B, be carried out, and how much more difficult it will be, in all likelihood, to choose the investments that we make at a time of exceptional resource scarcity. I can envision, for instance, what the energy people call low-hanging fruit. And we've done a lot of that through various energy programs. But low-hanging fruit that is relatively inexpensive, but also in many cases benefits the people who could already afford to make energy improvements, let's just say. And if you translate energy improvements into reductions in greenhouse causing gases and so forth, there's a pretty direct relationship there. So my question or my urging, and it could be one or both, is A, that I think it's really important to develop a framework for decision making on how these investments are made that specifically includes an analysis of and the importance of the critical benefits that will help people who've traditionally been disadvantaged or have less economic power. Sort of goes back to my days long ago as a Pine Tree legal assistance attorney. And secondly, so there's the framework, the decision framework issue, and then there's the question of how the Climate Council and people who believe in following the recommendations of this report and making equity really an integral part of the work and the investment that is done, how we defend investments that are potentially more costly, and the benefits, the real money benefits, at least in the short term, are going to potentially be lower, because we, having come from the environmental advocacy community, cost benefit was constantly being raised as an essential way to measure the value of what we were trying to do. So it's, to summarize, it's how do we build equity into the decision-making framework? And then, and it may be the second side of the same coin, how do we defend investments that are critical to help lower income and traditionally marginalized or lower income populations, where they may actually be more expensive? I'm not sure they're good answers, but they're questions that I wanted to raise to get us thinking about. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. I hope that we'll see some hands come up with some responses to that. I'm going to go to Ambassador Dana and then to Sandy Buck's question in the chat. Ambassador?
Thank you. I just had a couple quick things for feedback about the report, and I've shared them with Director Pingree already. I would love to see tribal nations really talked about in a specific way. We talk about municipalities doing A, B, and C. If we could have municipalities and tribal nations, I think that's an important distinction that we like to see in our communities. And when we're breaking down, when we're listing out the specific vulnerable populations, adding tribes in Maine our tribal populations, I think is a good step towards really supporting our sovereignty. And on that note, I think all of the work in the Climate Council could really be made better by thinking more about tribal sovereignty and stewardships of lands and waters. And the tribal nations have some of the best natural resources departments and are doing some really great work on those fronts. So I think supporting our jurisdictional areas of control and that sort of thing, I think would really help all of this work. But to this report specifically, I would love to see some of that language about tribal nations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Sandy has a question in the chat for Suzanne about lessons learned that the Institute has learned from working with remote communities. How can they be applied to reaching vulnerable communities across Maine, from cities, suburbs, all the way down to rural areas?
Great, thanks. Yeah, thank you, Sandy, for that great question and for your role in so much of this too. You know, I think of a couple of pieces of work that I've been a part of in my time at the Institute. One is around trying to bring efficiency measures to the islands. We had an opportunity actually to partner with the Governor's Energy Office a few years ago to document the takeaways from that experience and to actually talk to the other highly rural states in the US, Alaska, New Hampshire, and Vermont, to look across the 4 states at what we know about rural access to clean energy measures. So it's a piece of work called Bridging the Rural Efficiency Gap. I can share a link to that. Another piece of work around the stakeholder engagement piece that I think of comes to mind is just a lot of the work that we've done in engaging communities around siting wind, particularly offshore wind. So I guess I would just sort of take 3 major takeaways from those 2 pieces of work. One is the need for trusted messengers or bridging institutions. The idea of making changes to your house or bigger technical issues is something that people can have a hard time talking about and feeling comfortable about. We have great resources out there in the world, but sometimes people don't understand them, like efficiency main incentives, or maybe don't feel comfortable figuring out what a heat pump is. There's definitely a role our work has shown in community groups and others that can be playing that trusted messenger role to help people both better understand and then also feel more motivated and help make these solutions more accessible, things like purchasing. The other piece is just the extra capacity that's needed to pull some of this off in particularly very small communities. It was interesting to see a lot of the working groups put proposals forward around enhancing technical assistance. I think we're recognizing that Maine communities have a lot on their plate right now, and some of what's being proposed can be complex, challenging to follow along. It means you may have to give up something else in order to focus on this. So what are models where we can build local capacity through an extra set of hands or some sort of technical assistance? And then just the last piece is that this transition isn't going to happen overnight, sadly. I hope it's quick, but the ability to follow along with this work it takes time. And that's that piece the point I made earlier. A lot of this needs to be relationship driven. We need to build trust and mutual understanding. There's a lot, obviously, that can be complex in communities that have not been treated fairly, equitably, that have been left behind. But we've got to make those commitments to showing up for each other along the way and keep each other in the loop about what's going on. So it just sticking with it for the long haul, I think, has been a big piece of what we've learned in stakeholder engagement along the coast. So thanks for the question.
Thanks, Suzanne. There's a great comment in the chat here from Leslie in response to Senator Carson's comments. The cost-benefit analysis for improving housing quality and heating efficiency ultimately will improve health and reduce healthcare costs, as Dr. Shah suggested. I know it's a long-term gain, but we must talk about the importance of long-term social benefits to equity. And that's great. I think it does start to bring in, again, that public health component of this. And so I'm wondering if anybody wants to speak a little bit more to that. Maybe Leslie, you could say a little bit more about what you wrote there in the chat.
Yeah, I think what Senator Carson brought up, he's got a lot of experience, and I've been following you for a long time, Brownie, but and that's a practical approach, but the reality that he points out is that when government looks to low-hanging fruit, the kinds of things that will come up are going to be things that have immediate payoff. But the real payoff in society for improving equity, let's say in housing, but that I just use that as an example, is, you know, around here you have, I go into homes all the time that have doors that don't close. And then you talk about insulating windows, which doesn't make any sense if the doors don't close. And so that is more costly, as was mentioned early in the presentation, that it costs more to improve housing stock or improve people's homes than it is to build a new building that has solar panels. And the truth is that we need to do that, because that long-term benefit is the health of the population, which ultimately will save us a lot of money in this state, because the people we're talking about are, you know, in Maine care, and the state is spending a lot of money on healthcare. So the difficulty, and I leave it up to Senator Carson to figure out how to do this in the legislature, is to really make it clear that not let it slide under the rug, but really make it explicit that there is explicit economic gain to be had. It's just not in the next financial cycle, the next economic cycle, which is 12 months or 24 months. And so I think that that's the problem we face here.
Just another question to throw out there for the Mitchell folks, or just in general. I think this is, I mean, Leslie's comments I think are really apt. And I think the council, considering metrics that really hold ourselves accountable for the kind of things we want to accomplish. I mean, I think, you know, rural home improvement, weatherization, you know, there's a lot of things that maybe can be low hanging fruit, but they're going to require extra effort to do them well for all people. I would say another part of equity work is some of the potential economic opportunity that clean energy transitions are going to mean for Maine, whether it's renewable energy jobs, efficiency jobs, offshore wind. There's a lot. We are already seeing growth in Maine. And I think part of the challenge is, how do we make sure that, you know, those are good paying jobs that are, that people in Maine who most need those good paying jobs can access. And a lot of that actually is going to come back to workforce. And we're doing some work on that, as well as part of our overall economic plan for the Climate Council. But I'm just thinking, to those of you working on this, how did you think about that side of things, sort of the job creation aspects of climate, and how we make sure those benefits are equitable? And there's the just transition piece. There are people who are delivering oil and they have jobs that will no longer exist in the future. Is that something that was on your radar screen?
One of the, these are such great and important points, and these were issues that were on our radar screen, and they're part of, again, what is so interesting about thinking about the climate change issues and thinking about equity, is it brings us back to these key issues that we're thinking a lot about as a state, which is, how do we get good jobs? How do we prepare people for those good jobs? And how do we find a way to make sure that those good jobs are close enough to where people are living, that we're not adding a lot of energy use to get people there? So everything's kind of intertwined, but there's really some interesting possibilities for thinking about how, by recognizing that they're intertwined, we can go back to the issues of, what are the community colleges and universities and K-12 doing to help prepare people as jobs change? What does that look like, and how can we work on that together? What does it look like to think about the needs of the new jobs? So that's a kind of long answer, but definitely the interconnection, we were thinking about it, and there are such talented leaders in Maine who could say, let's not treat these as separate issues. Let's think about what the possibilities are here for what could happen. David or Sarah, does that kind of fit with what we talked about?
Sarah?
Sure. Yeah, one other thing I would say, you're totally on point, Linda, is that this goes back to a point that we tried to make really explicit in our report, which is that uplifting the people in Maine who need it the most will benefit all of Maine. And I think that that also kind of gets at Senator Carson's point about how do we address the issue of the low-hanging fruit versus what might be most effective. And seeing this job creation that we hope will begin, and saying, okay, we can uplift the most vulnerable by providing them with jobs. And by uplifting the most vulnerable, we can help all of Maine, right? Because that's going to include all of Maine's economy. All people in Maine are going to benefit from those who need it most getting the help that they need.
And there are just so many opportunities for us all to work together, to have this be, I mean, there are great people from the university system on the Maine Climate Council. And how do we keep this going where we're all working together?
Yeah. I was just going to add, going back to Senator Carson's comments about how you do this in the legislature, the political and economic parts of this. I don't have the experience that so many of you have. It took me a while to get to Maine, but it seems to me that you have the stories of people like Senator Muskie, who made the case for a long-term investment in environmental improvement here in Maine and all over the country, and then the United States became a leader in the world for environmental stewardship. And I just would like to think that we can talk about both immediate challenges and long-term goals and link those things in ways that would be compelling for many different Maine people.
Great,
Great,
thank you
thank
all.
you all.
There's just point out some case studies and links and comments in the chat here, and then hand it over to Director Pingree to send us home for the day.
Great. Well, thank you. I mean, I really just want to thank again the Mitchell Center, the advisory members, Ambassador Dana, the Climate Council members for another meeting this week. This is a multi-meeting week, including Ambassador Dana, who's a member of the Maine Climate Council. So I think that this is really important work that I think is, I would highly encourage you to, again, really read through this report. And as we start to really tackle each issue where we have to make a decision, where we have to weigh in on the direction that we're going, thinking about these things as we set that course is essential. And then thinking kind of process-wise about how we make this work long-term, whether it's additional groups, whether it is metrics, whether it is all the above. I think that's really the challenge that's in front of us. So again, I just want to thank everyone here, Brian, for really doing some heavy lifting, bringing it all together. Again, we will see the Maine Climate Council on Thursday morning, if not before. We've got 3 more meetings scheduled before we finalize the plan, and we've got a lot to do. So I think I really thank people for spending an hour and a half this afternoon focusing on this issue. I think it's one important to the governor. I think it's been really well stated by all of you why it's important. So look forward to making this not the first, but the first of many conversations on this issue. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Have a
Thank
great
you.
night. And Ambassador Dana, I'll see you soon.
Thank you.